of today, of our lecture, and let me give him the board. Okay,
Just
welcome.
to inform you, excuse me for interrupting. My name is Jordanka from Bulgarian Biodiversity Foundation. I will be hosting the webinar for you, and I want to inform you that it will be recorded. I have already allowed Mr. Kaspar to start recording so that the webinar is available after its making. It will be available for others also to see it. So please, Jan Kaspar, start recording.
It's already started.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Joranka, for introducing. And Mr. Plesník, if you can hear us, you can start with your lecture, please.
So good afternoon again. My name is Jan Plesník. I'm at the Nature Conservation Agency of the Czech Republic based in Prague, where I am dealing with science policy interface and international collaboration. And I've been involved in various biodiversity-related issues at a global, pan-European, EU and national level. So hoping that I'm not going also to share with you the latest scientific knowledge, but also some experience from the practice. I'm very glad, and I would like to really express my thanks to the Bulgarian Biodiversity Foundation and Professor Kaspar allowing me to have this presentation and these lectures, because knowing that we are now in Europe under not so standard and in many respects difficult times. So I will be really pleased to share some views on the topic related to conservation policy. I would like also to highlight the fact that this is not the very start of the course, because we were lucky enough having the very first lecture as face-to-face, and now I would like really to continue in the presentation. We will rather overlap with what was said, but now having more time, and please don't hesitate to ask me on various questions or your comments or views, because I'm sometimes going really to present relatively very recent issues which have not been included in university textbooks or reports or various documents, and we can really debate it in more details. Therefore, I decided to have really more time for the very first lecture. And again, the issue is that I would like only to wrap up what was said. I'm not going now to repeat what is policy, what is conservation policy, which are main tools, what is nature, what is landscape, what is biological diversity, which are the main task of nature conservation, which are main methods of nature conservation, because we have in the fact we're dealing with this in the first lecture. So I would like now to remind us that nature conservation, as all the branch of human activities, has developed some key paradigms. Paradigms, this is really the key concept, key idea or framework idea, which is then elaborated by various strategies, programs, projects, and also is implemented in the everyday practice. And when we started with the key paradigm for nature conservation, we can go back to the 1830s, when nature conservation had established itself as a independent, separate, and respected branch of human activities, because of course there had been a lot of activities related to nature conservation even starting in before the human civilization appeared, but these were individual attempts, individual events, and so on. But the nature conservation as a really branch of human activity, as a very specific discipline, had established itself in 1830s. At the time, the key paradigm was wilderness. That means the idea was to protect, to conserve, to maintain wilderness. And even because it was in the 1830s up to 1880s, the idea was from the beginning not only wilderness, but probably influenced also by culture. The idea was to preserve really the romantic wilderness. And therefore, at the time, even when the first protected areas were established, the idea was to preserve romantic nature like virgin forests or primary forests, geysers, or some rock formations and so on. Then it was replaced in the 1880s in the second phase of the nature conservation development, and at the time the idea that nature is in fact a heritage monument, that preserving nature is the same activities as preserving culture monuments like pyramids or galleries or castles, and the idea was even so strong that at the time it was even possibility to establish the very first nature conservation agencies. It was in Germany in 1912, dealing with the nature conservation, aiming namely at maintaining heritage monument. There was also a moral appeal saying nobody is going to destroy Egyptian pyramids or Louvre gallery. Why we are continuing in destroying our nature and the landscape? Then it was quite later. It was namely in the 1960s. The idea which was taken from science was that the main paradigm for nature conservation is to maintain, restore, or to keep nature's balance. Then it was replaced in the late 1980s by the idea of biological diversity and sustainable development. And since the new millennium, there are two new paradigms. One is ecological or ecosystem integrity, and the second one or the other is ecosystem services. I would like to stress that the fact that, for example, the idea of nature as a heritage monument was replaced by the paradigm of nature's balance definitely does not mean that there will be no attention paid to nature as a heritage monument or even the idea of wilderness. You know that, for example, today we are really now facing the restoration of ideas of wilderness, namely in Western Europe and in the US. That means that paradigm means that there is a really new concept, new framework, new basic idea which appeared and is being elaborated by strategies, programs, projects, or everyday activity. So in the 1960s up to 1980s, the idea was that mission of nature conservation is to improve if it is degraded, or to maintain if it is still existing, or even to restore balance of nature. Again, I would like to stress the fact that simply I don't like to present pictures downloaded from internet. So during all my presentations, there will be my pictures, except of some cartoons or graphs and so on. And this is one of the very nice site close to Prague called the St. Prokop Valley, which is very important because of the unique paleontological and geological history, but also really harboring some remnants of original dry steeps on the slopes. And what is the most important issue, that there are some nature reserves, but the area as a whole is a natural park, and in the Czech Republic that means that there are some parts which are accessible for tourists, and this is very favorite place to be visited during weekends by Prague citizens. And why the idea appeared, and I would like now to repeat something from classical ecology. And the classical ecology was based on the perception that ecosystems are usually in long-term, close, deterministic balance with environmental controls. That means that the idea was that with some generalization, because it was at a time where cybernetics had appeared as a new, very popular discipline, and this idea was taken from the theory of systems, and ecosystems were really seen as close systems which are run by ourselves and which are simply as a robots in very deterministic way. That means that it was said that there is strong direction of any ecosystem, and we can very simply come with the prognosis how the ecosystem is going to be developed. The photo was taken, indeed, it is from the so-called Forest of Giants in the Mount Phil National Park in Tasmania. And these trees are among the tallest in the world. The species is Eucalyptus regnans, and in English it is surprisingly not called eucalyptus, but mountain ash or Tasmanian oak because of timber. This is the very nice example of wilderness, because some of the trees we were possibility to see were almost 90 meters high. Classical ecology also use the analogy on habitat and species distribution, which could be described as hand-in-glove relationships. Simply said, it was presumed that all niches are full and all species are in their proper places. That means if we have one part of the globe, it is occupied by only one finger, and there are no empty fingers, and all fingers are in their proper place. It is based on the very first definition of ecological niche elaborated by American ecologist Hutchinson and others. The photo, this is a very nice owl, which is in British English called Tangmalm's owl, and in the American English is called Northern Boreal owl. It is primarily occurring in the boreal forest, that means in the taiga, but there are some remnant populations even outside the taiga biome. And I took a photo. This is from the Jizera Mountains in the northern part of the Czech Republic, close to the Polish border, and I took this owls from a nest box because 30 years ago I distributed with students more than 1,000 nest boxes for birds of prey and owls, because at the time there was really a lot of dead forest caused by acidification, by acid rains, by the air pollution. There were almost no trees, but there was a lot of new established grassland with Calamagrostis trees, and there was a lot of rodents and small mammals. So our idea was to attract predators here to allow us to stop the damage done by some walls on the seedlings which had been planted there to replace the original forest. Even if we will be seeking for the one of the most influential book, that means that at that time it was in addition to the, for example, Silent Spring and other books, it was a book called Patterns in the Balance of Nature and Related Problems in Quantitative Ecology, because it was, as very simply seen from the title, was dealing with the balance of nature, and it was one of the books trying to come with the quantification of nature. That means not only with the qualitative description of processes, but to quantify them. And in the mid-1990s, there was the rapid development in ecosystem ecology. Let me remind us that in Europe, we are speaking about ecosystem ecology, but in the US, there is the term conservation ecology, because conservation ecology in American English is dealing with the ecosystems, namely, while conservation biology with species and habitats. And there were some contributions by scientists from the US, from Scandinavian countries, Netherlands and Australia. And the idea, which is called new, so-called new non-equilibrium paradigm of nature, appeared. And the idea is quite different when compared to the classic ecology. And I would like to stress the fact that although it appeared 25 years ago, still it is not so very much included in the textbooks, although as I will try to explain to you, there is a lot of evidences behind. What is the difference? We can simply say that nature is flowing. That means that nature is much more dynamic than we simply assumed before. And why it is possible? It is because ecosystems are often open to external controls. That means that, contrary to this cybernetic view of nature, ecosystems are in the fact open to external influences, external factors. That means that they are not closed black boxes. More, they are frequently non-deterministic. That means that the flow of nature is so dynamic that we can only rarely be able to say that in 20 years ago there will be ecosystem like this, because really the nature is so dynamic, and the ecosystems are rarely in equilibrium. No final stage to be fixed is because even the final stage can be changing time to time and place to place, of course, and therefore it is a really flux of nature. I would like also to highlight the fact that in English there are two words for stability. One is balance, which is long-term stability, and one is equilibrium, which is short-term. And I apologize to my students that I'm going to repeat it because there are now more people, also not only the students. The photo here is from the Iguazu Waterfalls National Park on the border between Brazil and Argentina. This is the biggest waterfall in the world, and it has been recently declared by millions of people having been able to vote on the internet, being one of the so-called 7 new nature wonder of the world, because there is from 150 to 300 waterfowls in this complex. The breadth of the waterfall system is 4 kilometers, and they are high up to 90 meters. And why I am showing the photo is that I took a photo on the April the 1st, just in, let me say, it was in 2006, and in July there was no water. There was so horrible drought in Brazil that all water disappeared. And when having, for example, lectures for the general public also on climate change, I guess that personally, I could hardly find any better evidence that something has been changing in our climate. Because if you remember this really horrible amount of water, the waterfalls can be heard from kilometers away, and in a short term, all water simply disappeared. Ecosystems in these paradigms have multiple short-term stable states. That means instead having one long-term balance, there are multiple short-term stable states. That means that ecosystem is driven by some disturbance outside the equilibrium, then trying to reach equilibrium again, but this is not the same. And the process has been repeating. That means that this is iterate repetition of the short-term stable states. Of course, it depends on the scale. If we will have a really big scale, then we can see instead having a series of short-term equilibriums, one balance. But if we are really being very close to ecosystem and having short-term period to study them, then we will see that instead long-term balance, there is a series of multiple short-term stable states. And what is also the quite surprising issue when compared with the classical ecology, when disturbance were considered by the ecologists in the 1930s and 1940s as being rare in nature, first, and second, being always negative, having negative effect on ecosystems. But now we have recognized that disturbances are fundamental. They are even keeping ecosystems in their state, and They can be harmful, of course, but many of them, or a lot of them, are useful for the ecosystem. The photo was taken at the Bachelor River Soldier Station in the Yellowstone National Park. You can see that there are even, just in the upper part of the photo, there are the result of this huge fire which appeared in the Yellowstone National Park in the late 1980s can be seen there, but there is really restoration, and this is for the debate. We have no time to read about the, you know, that in the, for example, United States and in Australia, there is always debate on the fires, forest fires, whether they are useful or whether they are always harmful, as seen by humans. And this is the example when now, if you will visit the Yellowstone National Park, you can also see that the ecosystem was able to recover itself now to be again, there are again very nice forests and so on. And the animal just in front of the photo is elk, wapiti, and why I was mentioned that the place when photo was taken is called Soldier Station, because when the Yellowstone National Park was established in 1871 as the very first national park worldwide, it was managed by the US Army, because US National Park Service was established in 1916, and by that time Army soldiers were responsible for management of the Yellowstone National Park. Ecosystems processes occur in many spatial and time scales. That means that, of course, there are some common general patterns for ecosystems, but ecosystems can be also seen as the unique entity very often. This photo is taken from the Lahemaa National Park in Estonia, because Estonia is the country with the highest proportion of peatland on its country territory. Peatlands with the peat layer bigger than 30 centimeters covers 20% of the Estonia. And I would like also remind us that with respect of the now very popular carbon sequestration, there is no better ecosystem as peatlands, because peatlands cannot be saturated by carbon, and peatlands worldwide harbor the same amount of carbon as the whole atmosphere, although covering 3, 4, 5% of the terrestrial land on the Earth. That means that simply when advising to decision makers and politicians, we should say that instead to seek for various biofuels, preserving or restoring peatlands, it is the best way and the most effective way how to really support carbon sequestration. That means capturing carbon and keeping the carbon outside the air. Other so-called magic words in the conservation policy, which are related to the non-equilibrium new paradigm, is heterogeneity and patchiness. And this is the idea which was elaborated by landscape ecologists in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the idea is that the landscape consists of a mosaic of various habitat patches. And this is a very important issue, for example, also for species conservation, because we are often saying that, for example, forest is enough to be maintained for protection of some forest species, but in the fact, even forest is seen by animals as a mosaic of suitable or optimal or suboptimal or even not optimal habitats patches. And why I put there a photo of a cow, it is because once there was a seminar and one of my colleagues said that this is really a remarkable step in landscape ecology when speaking about heterogeneity of the landscape or patchiness, that the patches can be seen, for example, from airplanes or satellite images. But I try to explain to him that when we are really adopting this new non-equilibrium paradigm, then in the fact, and he said that the landscape therefore is something like a skin a cow. That means there are patches of white and patches on, in this case, brown color. But when taking into account this new paradigm, that we can say that it is not so stable. These patches are moving because their borders are moving, and also the cow itself is moving, yeah, because landscape is also dynamic from a holistic point of view. And therefore, I introduce the wording that landscape is a flowing mosaic of changing habitats. And apologies for saying something which is definitely well known, but this is the meta-population dynamics, the idea which appeared in the late 1960s. Paradoxically, it was not a biologist, but a scientist dealing with mathematics who introduced the idea, and the idea is that meta-population is a population of populations. That means that there are local populations which are interconnected with the other populations, with the animal and plant or wildlife or other organism like fungi movement in the landscape. And what we can see, that we can very often find in the landscape empty but perfectly suitable habitats for some species, and they are not occupied by the species. There are obviously two reasons. One is that the patch with the perfect suitable habitat for some species is too far, that it cannot be reached by movement across the landscape. Or the other explanation could be that it is not large enough. But this is well known, and now we have recognized that this is not case only in the landscapes which have been modified by humans, but also with relatively not affected landscapes with these empty patches for species. And there is something which I would hardly say when speaking with politicians, but now I will have to say that it was found, and is based on a very complex and comprehensive review of articles, that we can lose from 10 to 30% of local populations each year, but the metapopulation has been still functioning. That means that, simply said, if we have well-connected populations of some species within the metapopulation, we cannot fight for any single population, because from 10 to 30% of this local population can be lost, and the metapopulation will be functioning. That means that, on the other hand, that it is very clear that to keep connected population is crucial, and I'm sure that we can provide us with a lot of population when habitat fragmentation is disrupting this interconnection, and that the habitat fragmentation is really a serious issue. Although in the last 2 years there are some reviews in the scientific literature saying that at least in some cases the importance of fragmentation, the negative effect of fragmentation, has been overestimated. But still, it is clear from this view that what we need is not only to have as much of viable population of the particular species available, but also to have interconnection between them. That means exchange of individuals of the species between the individual local populations. And even more, the metapopulation theory was also applied in the community ecology, or assemblage, or community conservation biology, and we are now also speaking about meta-community. That means communities of communities again interconnected each other. The Sinkser's theory is also saying, and I'm sure that you are familiar with this, saying that there are some sink population which are providing the other population with the individuals, because natality is even higher than mortality, and emigration is always higher than immigration, and this is the source populations, and the sink population is vice versa. That means that where the natality is lower than mortality, and the sink population should be fed by individuals by immigration from source populations. And what is one of the outputs of the theory of Sinkser's is that species are often in unsuitable habitats. That means unsuitable habitats are also occupied by species. This is again something which was not accepted by the ecologists 8 years ago, and even more, we know that there are habitats or ecological traps. That means that there are some habitat patches, which are always functioning as sinks for the species, but they are attracted. These species are really preferring these unsuitable habitats. Sometimes we have no idea why. Sometimes it is because some mistake, for example, with respect of the light coming to their eyes and so on. But what is sure at this moment, that when these idea of habitats or ecological traps appeared, it was thought that these habitat or ecological traps are rare in the landscape, but now we have recognized that they are relatively common, both in the non-disturbed as well as the disturbed landscape. And there is the photo of moose. I took a photo in the Kampinoski National Park in Poland, and why I'm showing you is that this is the example of the species which in the fact migrate in the late 1950s in what is now the Czech Republic from Poland, because this huge ungulate had been reintroduced to Kampinoski National Park close to Warsaw from the eastern Poland, and namely young males started to move to south, and they were moving across the Czech Republic to the southern part of the country, and at that time there was an iron curtain, and they had to stop. They were not able to pass iron curtain, and they returned back and were seeking for the habitats to be used by them, similar to those in eastern Poland, and therefore two small populations of this elk were established in southern Bohemia, and it was in the 60s and 70s. And then we found surprisingly one population not far from Prague, and it was in the farmland. And we said, how it is possible? Where is the problem? And the population of the moose, Alces alces, has been declining, the two small populations I have mentioned. And then we recognize that these big animals are not able to pass the highway D1. This is the most important highway in the Czech Republic, from Prague to Brno and then to Bratislava or Ostrava, and they were not able to pass it, and they come back. So even our colleagues from the Bohemian, Moravian Highland branch of the Nature Conservation Agency of the Czech Republic had to move artificially these elks across the highway. Now we are thinking about to have some overpasses, so-called serried ducks, to allow to big ungulate to pass through the highway. But of course, this is not cheap exercise. And what about the hand-in-glove analogy I have mentioned? What was now being the output of this new paradigm is that a glove has a few extra finger pockets where are no fingers. That means they are empty. There are some finger pockets where are two fingers in one, and most pockets are occupied, but not all. That means that this is quite a new idea, which has been. Pardon? To mic, yeah, to be more to mic. Yeah. So I will now to repeat that the hand-in-glove analogy is changing. That means that what we have recognized is that there are some finger pockets in a glove where are no fingers. That means they are empty. This is this, for example, this empty habitats. But on the other hand, there are 2 fingers in some pocket. That means that some patches are occupied, some niches, by more species. And most pockets are occupied, not all. That means that instead of having perfectly fitted glove, we have glove with some empty pockets, with the pockets where are more than 1 finger. And generally, this is not so regularly as it was mentioned before. That means that at this moment, the idea is that in the fact, the rule, 1 niche, 1 species, cannot be always right in nature. The photo here is from the Nakuru National Park in northern Kenya, which was established in the early 1960s. And you can see as the habitats there, this is a mixture. The lake is just in the upper part of the photo. There is the cover of the lake. You can see also here a mixture of savanna and gallery forest.
Sorry, can I ask, or it's possible after the lecture? Can I ask?
Ask just now, no problem.
Okay. It's the question is about metapopulation.
Yeah.
And you were talking that if, for example, some part of like population in the whole metapopulation, for example, extinct, we should recover the patches. So like another population will be source for the place where the population extincted, right?
Yes, that means that also there is dynamic in this metapopulation, that some local population become extinct naturally or because some anthropogenetic pressure. But if the habitat is here, and if the individuals from such population are, it can be repopulated.
Okay, then I have a question. It's about birds. So, for example, like they move in the air.
Yeah.
And if, for example, one population, okay, I can give their exact example.
Yeah.
For example, in the Mediterranean area, like the whole Mediterranean area is like covered by flamingos, and like it's like big metapopulation. Like in France, there is population. Like in Italy, there is population, and it's whole like in the whole Mediterranean area, there is like big metapopulation. And if, for example, in Camargue, located in south of France, the population of flamingos extincted. So do we need to wait when flamingos from another population, for example, from Italy, can come to Camargue, so we recover this extincted population in Camargue, or we should change some anthropogenic conditions, so make it better, or for example, create nature reserve, or like to preserve like the, let's say, left species, just a few of them, or we should just bring physically, like humans bring birds from another population to Camargue, for example, they're very extinct. So I don't know how it really works with birds, for example, because you gave examples like with animals that can really like terrestrially come to their empty place.
Yes.
Work with birds.
Yes. For birds, it is the same, because the population, of course, we are speaking about breeding populations nesting somewhere. The greater flamingo, Phenicopterus ruber is quite a good example. Why? Because it is extremely sensitive and extremely vulnerable, because it is a colony species. That means that the colonies, the breeding colonies, are really extremely vulnerable. And there are some breeding colonies newly established, for example, in Italy. What is the very important issue is that in Italy, some breeding colonies are in fact in the suburbs. That means that these flamingos are not definitely always seeking for the not disturbed nature. And with respect of, I guess that, for example, when the greater flamingo population in Camargue disappear, it would be a real problem, because this is source population. It can be seen very simply because close to this source population there are always small satellite populations which are not, for example, permanent. That means some young species established their depopulation, and you know that the flamingo population in Camargue is very much sensitive, namely to the eutrophication, and because of the load of nutrition coming from the inland France, and also unfortunately some pesticides and some for example also PCBs, and therefore there is I remember that if you will visit the French National Museum of Natural History in Paris, there is an interactive model of this colony, and you can in the fact put in this model various level of the contaminants, of the pollutants, and you will see how many breeding pairs can be influenced. But at this moment, what is the other problem related to the flamingo colonies in the Mediterranean region is, I'm sure that you have heard it, is the problem with the greater flamingo colony in the Doñana National Park. Because in the Doñana National Park, the problem is that, and to be honest, also because of subventions, both from the Spanish but then from the European Union, that in the vicinity of the national park, although there is as a buffer zone nature park, but there is a lot of plantation of strawberries and oranges, and there is high extraction of water from the Doñana National Park. And the issue we debated just 10 days ago on the video conference, how to proceed further, because the European Commission was put the Spanish government to the European Court of Justice, saying that the high water extraction from Doñana National Park is inappropriate. So we will see. But on the other hand, when speaking about quite good, this is bad news, but good news is also when comparing the greater flamingo with the Phenicopterus minor, with the species which occur namely in East Africa, in these natural lakes in Kenya and Tanzania, that it is clear that sometimes the whole colony can be moved itself from the habitats which will become unsightable for the colony, for example, because in this case, because of high salinity.
So,
okay. Yes.
Yeah. Just to clarify. So, if, for example, colony extincted or the colony left the place because of anthropogenic factors, do we need to wait when some like flamingos from another colonies come?
No. I guess at this case, if the habitat is here, if there is protective regime like national park, then in addition, this site is in the natural distribution range. So then we can go immediately to the reintroduction. Reintroduction if there are none individuals left, or restocking if there are some few individuals left to restock the population.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we can continue, and I would like to continue with the answer to the question how we can react on this just described paradigm of the new non-equilibrium state. And the response is called adaptive management. And adaptive management is a systematic process for continually improving policies. Therefore, we are now dealing with the issue and practices by learning from the outcomes of the operational programs. That means that this is a structured, iterative process of optimal decision making in the face of the uncertainty. So, these are big words, and I will try to explain it in a more easy way. Adaptive management means that we are really learning by doing. That means that we are applying some measure, some nature conservation measure in field, and we are assessing its effectiveness and its impact immediately, and consequently, we are keeping or changing these measures. That means that this is something like quasi-experiment. That means that while, for example, blanket management means that we have, for example, management plan, and we are trying to implement the management plan 10 years, and then we will see what has happened. The adaptive management means that we are really very flexible and very careful at the same time, but not saying we will do it for 5 years or 10 years, which are artificial terms, sometimes not related to the natural processes. I can demonstrate it better on this diagram that you see that we are facing some problem in management of nature. What we are doing first, that we assess the problem. We design the measures to be taken. The measures are then implemented. We monitor the impact of the implementation, evaluate whether it's correct or incorrect, whether it's really effective, whether it would not be better to combine the measure with the other measures, or whether we can really simply say this was a incorrect way. We should think about the other ways, then adjust and go again. That means this is the cycle of the adaptive management, and that means that this is something which we will try to implement in the practice. But on the other hand, we have some limitation. For example, we have some limitations in the law. For example, in my country, we as the Nature Conservation Agency, managing directly 15% of the territory of the country, because we are the public administration authority in nature conservation in protected landscape areas and nature reserve and national nature monuments. We are obliged, according to our law, to develop and implement management plans which last 10 years. And then we can help ourselves with the scenarios, saying what will happen if. That means that the scenarios, so-called scenario analysis, is quite good tool. Scenarios are not mathematical models. These are some alternatives of the future. So therefore we can use these scenarios when thinking about the management plans for 10 years, knowing that adaptive management should be applied. And back to our idea, that means that now it is clear that instead to speak about stable ecosystems, we should speak about healthy ecosystems, because the stability, that means the balance or equilibrium, as I have tried to explain to you, is not so common, long-term balance in nature. The photo here is the richest ecosystem by species number on the Earth's terrestrial land. Surprisingly, this is not Amazonia, but this is so-called Atlantic forest. This was primary or virgin forest along the East Brazilian coast, where is the highest number of species known recorded. And I took a photo in the Brazilian state of Paraná, but unfortunately, only 10% of the original forest left. 90% have been destroyed by humans, namely replaced by pastures for cattle. And what we need is something which is called evidence-based nature conservation. And this is the analogy with human health. That means that we are seeking to have healthy ecosystems. And what is the problem with any biological system, from the cell to humans or species or ecosystem, is that, and I apologize to my students to repeat it again, but it is important to stress the fact that ecosystems are nonlinear in their responses to the disturbances, to the external factors. That means that they are not repeating linearly to the external factor, to the driver. That means that, why? Because there is resistance, then resilience of ecosystem, and also something which is called carrying capacity. And resistance is the property of an ecosystem to remain essentially unchanged when it is subject to disturbance. What does it mean? Simply said, there is some external factor, some disturbance, like wind, like human pressure. And if the ecosystem is resistant, it is able really to show no symptoms of disturbance. That means that for the first sight, it looks like that something has been happening, because ecosystem is able to resist for some time to the external factor. And it is also, in other words, the magnitude of state that can be disturbed before an ecosystem changes its structure by changing the variables and processes that control ecosystem behavior. That means that this is the magnitude of the state. That means how long and under how strong pressure can be ecosystem able to resist to the external factor without no substantial changes. And you can see that this can be a problem, that if we are not going to monitor the ecosystem carefully, we can even say if the ecosystem is not changing itself, we can really come with more pressure, because ecosystem, as for the first sight seen, can resist it. But resilience is a quite different issue, because resilience, the resistance was about how strong is the ecosystem, but resilient is how flexible is the ecosystem, and it is the ability of an ecosystem to recover after a disturbance, or the rate at which an ecosystem returns to a single steady or cyclic state following a disturbance. That means that the ecosystem has not been able to be resistant anymore, so it has been changing, but still there is a power of the ecosystem to try to go back to the original state. But it can be stressed that the state which can be reached because of the ecosystem resilience is not the original. It is in optimal condition, it is very close, but it is not the same. The ecosystem is simply not able to come and to reach the same original or starting stage. And sometimes life is not easy, so in American English, resilience included resistance. And I said it, but I would like to stress the fact that now the resilience concept is very much popular among the professional and voluntary nature conservationists, namely in the United States. That, for example, one of the very influential US NGO, or in the fact association of NGO, is called Resilience Alliance. And they said that they are aiming not at the balance of nature, but they are aiming at supporting or enhancing the ecosystem resilience. And the third word I have mentioned is the carrying capacity. And what is the carrying capacity? Carrying capacity of ecosystem is the maximum number of individuals of a given species that ecosystem resources can sustain indefinitely without significantly depleting or degrading those resources. What does it mean? That means that this is the maximum of individuals inhabiting an ecosystem. Still is the maximum, but the number is not damaging the ecosystem. You know that normally there is the growth, the exponential growth in the later stage of the population development. Then the population has been reaching the carrying capacities, has been fluctuating along the carrying capacity. Then the oscillation and fluctuation is becoming lower and lower, and then the population is really able to reach the carrying capacity. The idea is very nice, but what is the problem? The problem is that it is clear that it is dealing with a single species. And we are living in the world when there are few places with a single species where most nature consists of assemblages or communities or guilds of species. And this is the weak point of the theory. But and at the same time, we are able at this moment to know which is the current capacity of some ecosystem, namely based on the fact that if the carrying capacity of the ecosystem is really reached, and the numbers of the population, the size of the population has been still increasing, then it is very clear that there can be collapse. That means failure of the population, because simply there are no more resources. And also it depends on the role of the species, whether, for example, it is keystone species for the ecosystem, but also it is serious for the future development of the ecosystem. But you can ask me, and this will be fully a legitimate question, and what about the carrying capacity of the Earth when thinking of humans? And this is rather complicated for humans, and we can be dealing with this issue in details. That means, is there any capacity of human population with respect of the functioning of the Earth? And we are going to deal with this issue in one of the next lessons. Now we can reach the other nature conservation paradigm, and this is biological diversity. Now I will be relatively short because the topic has been elaborated more in details during the course biological conservation. So I will only wrap up the most important issue from the point of view of nature conservation policy. Biological diversity is the variety of life in all its forms, levels, and combinations, or this is the variability in and among of biological system of all the levels. The second definition is very clear, but we can add what are the biological systems, of course, because at this moment there are more than 40 definitions of biological diversity in scientific literature and policy documents. So the issue is how we can characterize simply biological diversity, if this is possible. The photo here is from the virgin forest or primary forest. It is rainforest on the Pacific coast of Colombia, in northern part of the country. And when speaking about biological diversity, we usually recognize three main levels. This is diversity at the gene level, starting from the diversity of nucleotides up to diversity of population. Then organism, it is the best known level of biological diversity because it also includes species, and often biological diversity is considered to be a diversity among species only, but this is also genetic, organism, and ecosystem. The ecosystem level of biological diversity consists of not only ecosystems, but also landscapes, up to the global ecosystem, that means up to the biosphere. The three levels of biological diversity are overlapping each other. For example, as I mentioned, that populations are both at the genetic level. That means when speaking about gene pool of the population, and also organism, that means that, for example, communities, biotic communities or biotic assemblages are considered to be included both in the species or organism level as well as the ecosystem level. What is also important, and it is useful to mention, is that landscape are part of the biological diversity. Therefore, to speak sometimes about biological and landscape diversity is with some respect, in some respect, nonsense. And also, although the title is biological, that means something which is connected with the life. Biological diversity includes also abiotic environment, because when speaking about habitats, about ecosystem or landscapes, or about biosphere, we are also dealing not only with the biota, with the living component of the ecosystem, but also we are also dealing with the abiotic environment. Some scientists include also human culture as that means so-called culture, biodiversity, and as the fourth level, but it is not commonly accepted because there are some countries saying that although humans are organisms, they have human society which is not the same like biological diversity in these three levels. And on the international nature conservation agenda, they are strongly against including cultural biodiversity or bioculture diversity into the biological diversity. And namely in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States, some scientists came with the idea that there is the fifth level of biological diversity, which is molecular one. But it is not generally accepted because in point of view of most users of the word biological diversity, molecules are not living. They are chemical substances, and therefore they should not be included in the biological diversity. You know that even not saying before, because of this COVID-19 disease pandemic, but you know that still there has been a debate whether viruses are organisms because they have no cells, or whether they are simply molecules. Because some scientists are saying, okay, they are organisms because they have some patterns of the living organisms, but on the other hand, they are non-cellular. But some scientists say no, they are like prions, for example. They are chemical substances with the DNA or RNA, but they are not organisms. So, trying to wrap up, at this moment, namely 3 levels of biological diversity are recognized: genetic, species, and ecosystem one. And the photo here is from the Everglades National Park in Florida. This is American crocodile. You know that there is a huge success of the United States nature conservation because they were able to recover alligator. That means that there were 35,000 alligators left between the wars. And now, for example, there is more than 1 million in Florida, 1.5 million in Louisiana, and so on. But the American crocodile, which is the genuine crocodile, not alligator, has been rare in the United States. It is protected under the Endangered Species Act, and even in Florida, alligators are protected because because American alligators can be misidentified as alligators if hunting would be possible in a larger scale. But in other parts of Central America, the American crocodile is not so rare. It is also, for example, kept on farms in Cuba, and now there is quite good recovery because of farm breeding of this American crocodile in Mexico. Biological diversity, or diversity of biological systems, is an overarching hierarchy concept. You know, if you will remember that we are starting with the diversity of nucleotides and finishing with the global ecosystem, it is clear that this is really overarching hierarchical concept with 3 levels, and therefore it cannot be expressed by a single variable. Let me also to stress the fact that biological diversity is not a really issue of tropical lands as often recognized because people are watching movies from Amazonia or Kenya National Park, but because of its roots, because of its definition, biological diversity is everywhere. And therefore, this is not only issue of tropical countries, although I put there a photo. I took a photo in the Mexican province of on the Yucatan Peninsula. That means in the tropical part of this American country. And how is measured or quantified? Because we should be able to answer the question of politicians if they will ask us, for example, is biological diversity in the Czech Republic improving, or is stable, or is making worse? And to be able to come with a reasonable answer, we should know only the state of biological diversity, but also changes and particular trends, because trends are very much related to outlook, what will be in the future. Of course, we are not able to quantify biological diversity, that means each element of biological diversity, because of this complexity, because a comprehensive issue. But we can use a model components of biological diversity, and we can use indicators. And indicators are some indexes or some numbers which can help us to answer the question about the state and changes and trends in biological diversity. But as I mentioned, due to the overarching and complex and comprehensive character of biological diversity, we are not able to come with a few indicators like in the case of, for example, when measuring air quality or water quality, when there is, for example, 5 indicators enough. We tried to come with the limited set of indicators, and the most reasonable attempt we have made, both at the global or at the pan-European level, is 28 indicators of biological diversity, which is quite low, but quite high number, but we in the fact reduce it, but because of the complexity. We were, for example, asked some years ago by European Commission to come with a single indicator of biological diversity, but it was not possible. We can put some indicators and in the fact to develop and elaborate one single indicators consisting of some sub-indicators. This can be possible, but the question is then the interpretation. Because, for example, our South African colleagues proposed so-called naturalness indicators. That means indicator which is able to measure whether the ecosystem or landscape or area assessed is natural or semi-natural or artificial. But the problem is the complexity, because the formula itself is covering one page of the textbook. It is very complex, and in addition to the fact that you will have to have a lot of data to feed the formula, it is not easy to be interpreted and to be really presented to decision makers. So, therefore, a set of indicators is at this moment probably the best solution how to quantify biological diversity. The paradigm not only in nature conservation, but also in, let me say, development of the humankind, which appeared almost at the same time like the biological diversity, that means in late 1980s, is sustainable development. Also, this is again one of these really magic word, and sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their other needs. That means that the development which is able to meet the needs of present generation, but not facing the problem that we are going to pass to the future generation, the world, which is much worse than our, or at the time of our generation. Again, the definition is very clear, and this is very often cited definition because it appeared in the United Nations report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, and was entitled Our Common Future, and is known as a Brundtland report because the Commission, the World Commission on Environment and Development, was chaired, but at the time the Norwegian Ministry of the Environment, Brundtland, and by the way, she then became also the Norwegian Prime Minister, and recently she was a General Secretary or Executive Secretary of World Health Organization also, and they came with this very clear definition, but again, the problem is how to put the definition in the practice. Usually, there are three so-called pillars for sustainable development. Economic, this is red, economic growth. Then social, then means social aspects like social equity or social justice, and environment, environmental protection. And when these circles are met, this is sustainability. Now the question is, there are three, but I put there that there are four. There have been recently also the ideas that there should be also the fourth pillar of the sustainable development. And in the fact, these four pillars are two. One is good governance. That means that we need good governance to really, let me say, introduce or continue with the economic growth, social aspect, and environmental protection to be sustainable. And this is namely the view of, let me say, private companies or managers, that the fourth pillar should be that without good governance, there is no environmental protection or social aspect in economic growth to be implemented in sustainable way. But namely, from the social science, there is a strong voice that the fourth pillar is culture. Not only social aspects, but strong culture aspects to be taken into account when speaking about sustainable development. But again, because there is a lot of misunderstanding or fake news on sustainable development, so it can be stressed that sustainable development does not mean zero economic growth or even degrowth. Because it is always said, you know, you are coming with a sustainable development and you are asking us to go back to the prehistoric times, to go back to caves. This is of course some joke or total misappropriate explanation of this idea, but you can meet it not so rarely, saying that you are against, as environmentalist, against the economic growth. You are be happy, or you will be lucky if there will be no development economic and everybody will be poor and so on. This is totally misunderstanding or false interpretation of this idea. Why? Because it appears again, you can see it on the picture. This is the satellite measurements of the nitrogen oxide concentration in China, and you can see the situation in January before the outbreak of this COVID-19 disease, and right, this is the situation in February, where the economic was in fact not functioning in most part of China, and then it was again misused by some extreme environmental says it would be ideal, and on the other hand some anti-environment activists say now you are lucky because there is no industrial production in many parts of China. This is definitely not the case, because there should be economic growth, but it should not be the icon. It should not be really something which has the patterns of the god. And even there is the idea by some scientists saying that there should be sustainable degrowth as a transition phase. That means that we should stop to growth economically to move to the sustainability. But again, this is, in my opinion, unrealistic. That means that to say now we'll stop the industry and tertiary sector and agriculture and think how to move more to the sustainability. It can be done in reasonable ways, still economy growing, but not taking into account other issues like the environment, like social issues, culture issues. And the response to the global issues, we are going to deal with this issue later in the afternoon, is so-called United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is the collection of 17 global goals designed to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. This is like strong wording, but this is taken just from the United Nations key document on this so-called SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. and they were approved by the highest United Nations body, the highest United Nations decision-making body, and this is the General Assembly. It was in 2015, and it is for the period 2015 to 2030. And this is the idea that at this moment there is no more important United Nations agreed document for 15 years than this is, because this in the fact is the principle, at least theoretically, the principal United Nations political agenda. Here you can see that these are these 70 Sustainable Development Goals. The very first is no poverty, then zero hunger, good health and well-being, high quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation for the humankind, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth. You can see that really that these goals are taking into account economic growth. There is no wording about degrowth. The ninth goal is industry, innovation and infrastructure. Again, the magic wording, for example, now in the European Union. Reduce inequalities, both in South and in the North. Sustainable cities and communities, because you know that from the beginning of the century, for the first in the human history, there is more people living in cities or human settlements than in the countryside. For the first time in the human history, approximately the year 2000. Now, for example, I got the United Nations background document, which is called Global Environment Outlook for Cities. Now I'm going to review it during this weekend, where are the current knowledge of how really sustainable cities should look like, what is necessary to be done, but also how many funds we need to do it, who will be responsible, and which scenarios we should face. There is also issue which is of utmost importance, and again I'm going to deal it with more details during the other afternoon presentation, and this is responsible consumption and production. Then climate action. Probably at this moment climate change is perceived by most of the general public as the most important issue, in addition to the, of course, to this new virus disease. Life below water, that means fresh water as well as marine. Life on land, that means terrestrial ecosystems. Peace, justice and strong institutions. And the last is partnership for the goals.
Sorry, can I ask?
Yeah.
Because earlier you said that it's impossible to achieve zero economic growth, and it's kind of nonsense. But is it possible to have zero emissions, for example, by using some biofuels or something that doesn't affect so negatively on the atmosphere?
I guess that if you are speaking about the emissions, definitely we can reduce them, but not to, yeah, of course. For example, we can do it not so expensively with the sulfur dioxide. It has happened in Europe in the 90s because I remember that some years ago, or 20 years ago, one of these really huge environmental problem was acid rain. How is now? Where is now acid rain? Acidification and so on, still, but not so huge. But definitely we are not able to reduce the CO2 emission because CO2 is also a part of photosynthesis. If we will reduce CO2, then there will be no life on the earth. It's simple.
Thanks.
So that means that why I put there the photo. The photo is taken in the city, which has been regularly awarded as the most sustainable development city in the world, and this is Copenhagen. You can see that this is also the city in the world with the highest number of people going by bicycles. It is more than half of the Copenhagen population giving, for example, to work by bicycles. But not only this is really an example of the city which is seeking for the sustainable development and to be given as a good example that it is possible, that this is not Fata Morgana. And now the idea of the sustainable development have moved in the fact from generally sustainable development, and it was in the year 2012 when there was the conference, the United Nations high-level conference called Rio Plus 20, because it was 20 years after the famous United Nations conference on the environment and development held in June 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, which was really a milestone in the development of the environment protection, but generally development of humankind. And you know that unfortunately at this conference 20 years ago, governments were not willing and were not able to agree some commitments. Like in Rio, it was Agenda 21, and in the fact Convention on Biological Diversity, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And also there was issue because the Convention on combat desertification started to be negotiated there. And unfortunately, in Rio, the attempt to have the legal convention or piece of legislation, global piece of legislation, binding legislation on forest protection failed. But generally, Rio was really good, a big success. But at that time, when the conference was held 20 years ago, there was no willingness by governments to come with the new commitments, new duties with respect of the environment. But what they agreed is to support, at least by wording, so-called circular economy. And circular economy is one of the most powerful slogan now in the European Union. You know that this is part of so-called the Green Deal having been prepared. And it is simple. This is aiming at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources. Because we can really reduce dramatically waste. Because we have some countries where there is almost no waste. For example, in Japan, I spent there sometimes, but I have never seen there the garbage bin. Even in the Shinkansen train, there were small, let me say, bottles for recycling in this train in each coupe. Yeah, it was really And the same was the country which has a really high level of recycling in Europe is Germany. I'm proud that the Czech Republic is also among the top countries recycling. But according to some studies made by social scientists, both in Germany as well in the Czech Republic, it seems that we reach carrying capacity. That means that probably there will be no more people in these countries willing to recycle. Yeah, but still we can do it, and because some sentences saying that waste is badly used material, that we are not able to use it again and again. But of course it is not so easy, and we are dealing with this issue when speaking about plastics during the next presentation. Of course, sustainable development is not easy to apply in practice because, as I mentioned, that there are nonlinear responses from systems, not only from ecological system, but also from social systems. Social systems can be also resistant and can display resilience. And only after then they are going to fail. And this is the problem, that the idea is very nice, but it is not easy to be applied, to say, okay, now we are really doing everything for sustainable development. Or you know that there is really the nice wording that thing globally, locally. That means that sustainable development idea was also sometimes modified to be replaced or let me say enhanced by so-called sustainable living, which is let me say a complex of guidelines what we can do as individuals for sustainable development. Not saying this is an issue of all these prime ministers and United Nations Secretary General or European Commission. It is not the case. Sustainable living is really possible, and we can start it. And this is, I guess, one of the, apologize for using this very commonly frequent word, but this is really a challenge, for example, for our education systems, to really to start with the in best sense of the words, learning by doing with the children how to really spend our lives in sustainable way. And now we are reaching the two most recent paradigms in nature conservation, and those being elaborated by the conservation policy. And these are ecological or ecosystem integrity and ecosystem services. Ecological or ecosystem integrity is the state where in ecosystem structure and functional relations maintained are similar to those when natural biodiversity has been present. That means that the ecosystem display higher integrity, being in better or more natural conditions. And in other words, it describes the state of ecosystem complexity. It is also the extent to which ecosystems are healthy. That means that high ecosystem integrity means that the ecosystem are healthy. Like this photo is from the northern Sweden, from the Scandinavian boreal forest, boreal conifer forest, which is also known in this boreal Mongolian word taiga, really displaying high ecological or ecosystem integrity. Which are problems with this ecosystem integrity? This is the question, what is natural? Because if ecosystem should have high ecosystem integrity, it should be as natural as possible. And because, for example, for some parts of the world like America, Australia, or Africa, the baseline, that means the time limit, is arrival of Europeans. Before, it is considered that these continents were natural. Of course, this is not fully correct, because you know that there were some megafauna extinction in Africa, in Northern America, in Asia, or the mammoths and so on were killed by humans and so on. But generally it is this deadline. That means that before we see the continents, and reference baseline is arrival of Europeans. And in Eurasia, it is the last ice age, namely for the animal population. Sometimes it is also the discovery of America, because a lot of namely plant species were taken from North America or South America. The ecosystem integrity is, again, unfortunately, a rather complex issue. So there are 4 characteristics, and they are dealing more or less with the various biological diversity levels. It is native species richness, habitats under natural conditions, life supporting processes, and position of demand. Photo here is taken from the Pilanesberg Reserve in South Africa, which is very interesting because in the past it was the area which was totally covered by farms of Boers, white South Africans. Then it was given to some native people tribe, and then it was decided that it will be depopulated and the nature will come back here. And there was the huge campaign called Genesis, and thousands of animals were taken from the Kruger National Park, because some species had reached the carrying capacity of the Kruger National Park, despite the fact that it is a huge area, for example, elephants. So really, to move and to reduce the carrying capacity of namely large herbivores, they were moved to the Pilanesberg National Park. That means that you can see there all species like in the Kruger, but there is less people, and it is really more comfortable, not so spending time in the line of cars watching one single lion. So I can recommend to you, when going to South Africa, also to visit this Pilanesberg Reserve. Maintaining ecosystem integrity first. Maintaining numerous and therefore genetically good and viable population of native species within large enough non-contaminated habitats. This is about the species level. I'm not going in details because I presented it during my lecture for conservation biology course. The second is appropriate representation of habitats, ecosystem, and land use types in relation to their natural heterogeneity. That means that the higher complexity of the ecosystem means that as many as natural habitats are there. And this photo can illustrate the situation. This is the landscape on the Desertas Island, close to the island of Madeira, part of Portugal. And this is now because in the past goats were introduced there, and they're totally destroyed the ecosystem. There was no vegetation. And when they were reduced and even eradicated by killing, so the vegetation come back. And by the way, this is one of the best, probably the best site for the for the really preservation of one of the most rare, probably the most threatened European mammal, and this is the monk seal. Maintaining ecosystem integrity, that means strengthening life-supporting processes and function in ecosystem which maintain ecosystems. That means that these four main processes and their function to be not only species, but via species also these processes. That means that if there are viable, not disturbed life-supporting processes, that means that the ecosystem really provides the high ecosystem integrity. And the fourth issue is maintaining ecosystem integrity via humans. That in this concept, in this paradigm, humans are considered as a part of an ecosystem. They are not considered to be above as the rulers or lords of nature, but as an integrated part, and their interests should be met within the above limits. That means that, again, that ecosystem integrity doesn't mean that there are no humans. The photo can also explain the story because it is in the Plitvice ozera National Park in Croatia, which is famous, which receives each year more than 3 million visitors. And the problem is that probably at least in the summer, there is really probably carrying capacity of the ecosystem reach, because really there is a slowly moving row of tourists. But on the other hand, they bring really, it seems to me that almost 10 million euros each year, which are distributed also for the management of other Croatian national parks. But the issue is whether we are reached the limits as humans when visiting this famous national park with this nice landscape, with these all waterfalls and so on. And again, there is an analogy with human health. That means that we can carry out either a comprehensive check, which is called integrated ecosystem assessment, which is very time-consuming, very finance-consuming, human sources consuming, or which is, and I'm proud to say it, which is the European approach to seek for symptoms, whether there are some symptoms that ecosystem is not so healthy as it looks like for the first sight. That means we are seeking for a symptom, and then we can think about the ecosystem integrity. And the photo here, it is in so-called Martin Down National Nature Reserve in England, and you can see contrast. In front, this is a part of the National Nature Reserve. You can see there are shrubs and some vegetation. And behind this is culture landscape, which is normally cultivated for centuries. By the way, this is area where, not here, but close there, where the great bustard was. This huge bird was introduced in the United Kingdom. And again, ecological or ecosystem integrity is measured by various indicators. And the concept has been developed in the US in the 1990s, up to the beginning of the new millennia. This means this is relatively recent concept, recent paradigm, and in my opinion, this is really one of the way forward. Really, this is complex, but on the other hand, it can be applied more easily than sustainable development. This is also dealing with other issues than, this is more broader than biological diversity and so on. The photo here is, again, as I mentioned, this is, I took a photo some years after this horrible fire in the Yellowstone National Park, and these are geysers in the Yellowstone National Park. And last issue I would like to deal with is the ecosystem services as the very recent and very popular paradigm. And this is the idea that the benefits which are provided free of charge by ecosystem and which are maintaining human well-being, that means which are maintaining our society, our civilization on the earth, are called ecosystem services. This is, of course, anthropocentric point of view. I have some problems, for example, with the wording services, because that means it looks like that nature is servant to us. That means that we are lord of nature. And therefore, some scientists, instead these ecosystem services, introduced recently, 5 years ago, the term contributions of nature. That means that this is a really contribution to human well-being. This is not service, something you can pay it and you can stop it. Excuse me. Láďo, prosím tě, zavolej později, jo? And this is, in my opinion, better wording than ecosystem services. I apologize for that because I'm still in my home office, so probably there will be even more calls. I couldn't really stop it. The biocentric point of view is quite different. This is the idea that intrinsic, the inner value of nature is so high and so important for us that cannot be assessed, even measured, and even priced. That means the idea is that the nature is so important for us that we couldn't really measure it, and we couldn't really say that this value is $1 billion or so on. This is biocentric point of view. And the photo here is from the Victoria Falls on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe in South Africa. I took a photo last October because it is really nice, but I would like also demonstrate by this photo one fake which appear even in BBC or CNN or The Guardian. And because it was in the end of the dry season, there was only less water, little water in this waterfall, because normally there is water really, again, like during Iguazu. And the issue is that at this moment, it was normal, natural process, but it was presented by this mass media like the result of climate change. This is totally fake, because now I'm sure that there will be billions of tons of water, because this is normal process. And unfortunately, it was this presentation which was totally fake and misusing probably for the good reasons, for a good idea, but it was totally wrong and totally fake. And you know that there was the idea which was developed by Edward Wilson, this famous American scientist who also, in the fact, recovered the concept of biological diversity and in the fact came with the island biography theory. And also he came with the idea so-called biophilia. And the idea is that every person has a feeling, strong feeling for nature, because it is because of our roots and our evolution. But we can express it differently, in different way. Some people who like nature, some people who don't like nature. But the idea is that everybody, even because of this is a human character, so-called biophilia concept. Ecosystem services are, I go very briefly because I'm sure that you have heard it. I would like to use the classification which was developed by us during the multi-scientific or mega-scientific project called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and that there are 4 categories of ecosystem services. First are provisioning services, sometimes called ecosystem goods. These are, for example, food, raw materials, energy, and the second are so-called supporting services. That is, supporting services include, for example, nutrition cycling or primary production. All very important, soil formation. And the third category are regulatory services, for example, carbon sequestration, purification of water and air, flood and tsunami protection or protection against flooding and tsunami waves, culture services like spiritual values or provisioning opportunities for recreation, and therapeutic services. By the way, this is very important to say, provisioning possibilities for recreation, because once I was examining a student and asked her about culture services, and she said that nature is provisioning us with the recreation facilities, which is of course not correct. Nature are not provisioning us with the hotels or weekend house cottages and so on. These are opportunities, of course. There is common international classification of ecosystem services, which was elaborated by European Environment Agency some years ago, and there are these categories: provisioning, regulation and maintenance services, and culture. You can see that that 2 categories were merged from the previous classification because supporting and regulatory, because if we will be counting them, for example, for the economic purposes, there will be double count. And therefore, from the point of view of the so-called ecosystem accounting, these 2 categories have merged. Now the photo is from the Swiss Jura, from these mountains, not so known and not so visited like the Alps, but also having strong potential for developing the tourism. What are now I'm going to share with you something which should be called a SWOT analysis of ecosystem services. To be honest, I prepared it for the European Commission. When presented, there was the debate because for some colleague from European Commission, ecosystem services are iconas. It can be criticized, but I will try now to show you some SWOT analysis. What is what is the strong part of this idea is that we are stopping so-called the tragedy of commons, saying that in addition to the intrinsic value, nature and biodiversity have also other ones values, including economic. You know that the tragedy of the common is so-called, it appeared in 1968, and the idea is sometimes called common pasture. If there is common pasture for one community, everybody can use it, but nobody is in charge of it. And this is sometimes the issue of the nature, and therefore the tragedy of commons is stopping by this ecosystem services concept or idea.
I'm sorry, Dr. Plesník.
Yeah.
at 3:45 p.m. we should start a next webinar, and we should have some time for questions if there will be some more questions than we have until now. So just to say you that time is almost at the end. So just if you can, we can continue in the next webinar, of course, if you want, but just to know, just let to know.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Kaspar. So I would like now to ask whether there are any comments, views, or questions on the topics we have been dealing with.
Okay, so please, everybody, if somebody some questions for Dr. Plesník, please ask. Probably nobody has questions for now. So if you want, we can continue until 4:30.
Yeah, I will try because I'm almost at the end, so I will try.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, of course.
Won't we have a break, Sahar?
Yeah, we will have after we will have 15 minutes break after. That means from the half past 3 to 3:45.
Copy that. Thanks.
Yeah. It was I guess it was mentioned in the message from the Professor Kaspar or Professor Weir, I guess.
Copy that.
I'm not going to destroy you.
Okay,
You know.
All right, thanks. Thanks.
Yeah. That means that one of the strong elements is that this is the clear signal that investment into nature conservation is highly profitable when really taking into account ecosystem services. For example, cost-benefit analysis, protected areas worldwide. Annually, we spend $1 to $2.5 billion for management. $45 is needed by the benefits from the protected areas, both terrestrial and marine, is you can see much more higher. You can see that these benefits are some order of magnitude higher. That means from economic point of view, simply said, nature conservation is profitable. Also, the concept is broader than nature conservation because covering sustainable agriculture and green infrastructure. That means we are dealing not only with nature, but also with the sustainable agriculture or green infrastructure. Now the photo is from the headquarters of the Norwegian Environment Agency in Trondheim, and you can see that there is inside green wall. That means all these green roofs, green walls. This is a part of the ecosystem services concept, green infrastructure, not only nature. And the term has become relatively common. If you will put the wording ecosystem services into Google, you will receive 80 million pages where it is mentioned. What are weaknesses? Ecosystem services competes with other nature conservation main approaches because, for example, sometimes it is said by politicians, why we should deal with the protected areas. These are only part of nature, the landscape, but ecosystem services are everywhere. And we should be very careful saying, okay, but there are also traditional ways and tools how to deal with the nature to maintain it as a natural heritage. The photo is from the Danube River floodplain national park, which is close to Vienna in Austria. You can see this is floodplain forest there. Also that biological diversity is not considered as a provider of most ecosystem services, but as their byproducts. And I'm going to deal with this later. But what is the major weakness is that scientific theoretical terminology is rather problematic because we have no way how to really come with the value of ecosystem services except of provisioning, because they are simply not passed through the market. And all this also elaborated and comprehensive approaches how to assess them are indirect. They are not direct. And which are opportunities? Good environment and nature management can be considered as national wealth feature. Very important issue. Nations are rich not only because having a rich society, but having a really well-preserved landscape and nature. For example, in the Czech Republic, the total value of ecosystem services, except of regulatory ones, we calculated is 1.5 higher than GDP of our country. Also, ecosystem services approach can involve business sector into biodiversity conservation, because, as I mentioned, if somebody asks me what is the value of this grassland, and I will say intrinsic value cannot be calculated, for economists or politicians, it is the same like the answer 0. They need some numbers. Threats, damage to nature could be easily compensated forever by developers, particularly for small patches. For example, in our country, the worth of ecosystem services provided by floodplain forest is 18,000 euros per hectare. But if there would be the necessity to build a highway, then the government is willing to pay almost 15 million euros. That means that it can be overpaid. They will pay it and say, we are paying for a long time and we can now destroy the habitats because we paid for it and no words from you. And quantification of ecosystem services was introduced by Millennium Ecosystem Assessment when we introduced it in 1999. Our idea was not to pricing, to say the ecosystem services price is in dollars. Our idea is to find the most significant ecosystem service to be maintained for the future with a particular ecosystem. For example, what is the most important ecosystem services provided by mangrove? Not to say that 1 hectare is priced this and this. And unfortunately, various non-rigid and non-robust methods how to quantify and value ecosystem services can result in different values. For example, I try to use each of all these 4 approaches how to calculate ecosystem services value, and there are differences. That means that we have no single rigid methods how to do it. That means that if these various approaches are applied in different countries, there will be different prices for ecosystem services, and developers can move to the cheaper countries or regions, saying, okay, if I will destroy the nature, but I will pay less in Greece than in the UK. And also, which are these threats? The sometimes confusion between ecosystem services and their value. The services can be calculated, but they are often proxies, but valuing the same services is something different. For example, we calculated the value of 4 trees with respect of ecosystem services they provide on one of the island in the Prague downtown in the Vltava River, and it was 4 million Czech crowns, but nobody will pay it. It is too high. Yeah, if we calculate standard way, it will be 2 orders of magnitude less. And also that sustainability of ecosystem services means sustainability of their providers. That means ecosystem services. This is the natural forest in Florida. And is the service a mantra for nature conservation, the ecosystem service concept? The concept has been broadly accepted before being more elaborated, but on the other hand, can be useful under certain condition, but it should be interpreted carefully. So this is very popular, very fashionable way how to evaluate nature, but we should still keep in the mind this is one way how to do it. We have some other ways like intrinsic value of nature. And ecosystem services are not anonymous. They are mostly provided through biota. That means namely guilds, functional group of species. Simply said, conservation of ecosystem services means conservation of nature, species, habitat, ecosystem processes. And good environment and nature management can be considered as a national wealth feature. There is even the wording natural capital. This is stock of natural resources, and this is a specific type of the capital. We have financial, social, and cultural capital, and something which is called physical capital by classical economists or neo-economists, and they are now even able to distinguish between the physical and natural capital, because physical capital can be a machine, but natural capital will be forest. And there are so-called national ecosystem accounting. That means some nations or countries are calculating each year value of their nature. For example, in Australia, in the UK probably there is the most developed so-called national ecosystem accounting in Europe, in France or South Korea. And there is something which is called beyond GDP, saying that the quality of life cannot be measured only by the economic growth by GDP. And for example, Canada is assessing the provinces in Canada by measuring not only the economic growth, the GDP, but also the maintenance, the quality of nature they are preserving. And payment for ecosystem services has been in surprisingly, that means that people are paying for some other communities, for some people maintaining the ecosystem services. For example, people living in the downstream of the river are paying to people in the upper part of the river for not contaminating the river. And surprisingly, the idea is the most developed in Central America, in Costa Rica, Mexico, or Honduras. And something which is quite controversial is the biodiversity offset. This is the possibility that the developer will destroy nature, but is paying some offset, or is really, in some cases, recovering nature. That means this is payment for damaging the nature. Some NGOs are strongly against, some is saying it's better. And again, the idea is coming here from the United States, where this is part of the Endangered Species Act. So thank you very much for this moment.
Okay.
So we can, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your lecture. If there's nobody question, we should take the break, and I'm looking forward to see and hear you in around 15 minutes later.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for now, and let's stay with us more for this afternoon.
Thank you very much and have a break.
Bye.